Hello, everyone. Yes, we're here in Singapore. It's good to know. The next talk that Inside will host is from Lily Jencks. And she's an architect, a landscape architect, a teacher at the AA in London, and keeper of her father's cosmic house. I wonder if the role of keeper of the cosmic house may have influenced today's title and content, because we'll be hearing about the dark side of the moon, of which we all know very little, about landscape and architecture acting in the planetary system. And we touched on this earlier this afternoon, and I'm pleased to know that the planetary system is this planet, the planet we are on. So will you please welcome Lily Jencks?
Thank you, Nigel, for the kind introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming. My talk is titled Dark Side of the Moon, the Planetary Ambitions of Landscape Architecture. And I'm presenting today some projects that use different techniques to connect the local conditions and details of landscape to planetary dimensions. As we know, we're causing the sixth mass extinction and facing environmental emergencies on all fronts. We're busting through the planetary boundaries that we've identified, and possibly some we've not yet measured. And we all need to live and work towards creating a regenerative built environment. Nature, and yes, there's a lingering sense of that unfashionable nature with a capital N of the 19th century, is resilient, and it provides a huge number of free ecosystem services to us, keeping the balance of Gaia that has made this planet so far uniquely inhabitable. We know that a more inclusive and prosperous and equitable way of life depends on a healthy environment. The design, conservation, and understanding of that bottom rung of nature as a system and as a place is key, and landscape architects are on the right side of history for this project. But landscape has got an image problem. It's tied to traditional ideas of landscape as a passive view, a setting in which the more exciting human and architectural drama unfolds. Many of the issues at stake are invisible to us, hidden beneath the ground, or invisible as atmospheric gas. Or sometimes the scales are just too large, and the flows are too fast or too slow for us to see. Before we get too planetary, though, let me set out the traditional locus of landscape architecture. John Dixon Hunt, a landscape historian and my tutor at Penn, riffing on various other historians, identified these three concepts of nature: wildness, number one, first nature; second nature, farming; and third nature, as a cultural project, the garden. And Dixon Hunt adds to this another nature, fourth nature, which is the post-industrial space, often considered a kind of infrastructure integrated into the city, hybridizing with the man-made. Many of the incredible projects we see at WAF are of this type. And following the variation of an idea from my father, I'd like to add this idea of zero nature. He talked about it as the invisible laws of physics. But I'd also add to it the invisible flows and connections that we're part of, the atmospheric systems, algorithms, physics, but also genetics, the national and international policies, and market forces, the things that are invisible, but that are setting the forms of our planet. So it provides us with a wider repertoire for the site and medium on which landscape architects might work, and I'll argue provides an interesting consideration as we think about the implication of landscape as catalyst, which is all of the four natures impacting on the first. So landscape as catalyst, we were given catalyst as the idea for the talk today, and I took that very seriously. I always like a challenge, and it's an interesting way to think about landscape because it's about really what landscapes can do rather than that image problem. A landscape is always doing something. It's incredibly busy, it's generous, it's generative. It cannot be conceived of as static. It's always situated in a place, within a system. It's changing over time, creating context. And in that sense, it's that kind of global idea, because it's an individual site affecting a global system, the butterfly wings causing the hurricane concept. And in comparison to architecture, which can be abstracted, landscape is always situated in a location. And I'm trained as a landscape architect and an architect, and I love to compare the two because they are fundamentally really different. You might think, why as a designer shouldn't we be able to do both? But whereas landscape is contingent, you can think of architecture as an abstracted place. You can design it on the computer solely in Rhino, twisting it as a beautiful form. And it can have a concept of the tabula rasa. So that fundamentally, they're very different. Although you could probably go further back in time, I like to think of the history of the idea of landscape as a catalyst from Ian McHarg. He was working in the 60s at the program at Penn Design. He was mapping, making the invisible of landscapes visible. And he liked to map these overlapping systems of a site, arguing that superimposing them would result in better design solutions. This is a kind of form of landscape positivism, evolved into a contemporary ideas of landscape as performance, in which ecological functions are measured and optimized, and soon we'll find that they will be monetized too, right, with the carbon and biodiversity trading programs. This is landscape as performance, infrastructure, catalyst for human and ecological unfolding. At the same time, we cannot, for example, there are other diagrams that are important. Time is experienced over a large site, 4 square miles for fresh kills, and a 30-year time frame. Or diagrams that show how diversity evolves on a site of diversity of plants, species, program. Stoss landscapes using imagery to show how their projects act as both an active amenity space and floodwater storage. They're making the work, all these diagrams are making the work of landscape visible, that invisible zero nature visible, actively mitigating climate change issues and ensuring in that visibility that those services are appreciated. McHarg's project has been taken up by the landscape urbanists, which you all know are using, kind of fighting against the normal real estate development process to make landscape the driver of urban form and ensure that the green and blue infrastructure are designed before our gray. I want to present today some work that's not mine. It's some of my colleagues at the AA that I'm very excited about, Ground Lab. It's more theoretical, perhaps, than some of the work that we've seen. They're a landscape urbanism collective who have a residency at the AA at the moment and run the landscape urbanism course there. And they produce visualizations and cartographic tools that depict dynamics of urbanism to develop future scenarios and design strategies. I would say that they're working particularly on the zero nature, although they don't use that definition themselves. But they're making visible the invisible flows that are forming our built world. They investigate ways in which design can help tackle the climate, as well as to test new forms of collaboration. And indeed, their work is often used as the basis for new policies, such as the proposed UK Green New Deal. In Mexico City, and thanks to the British Council grant, AA Ground Lab, with their collaborators, have developed a digital tool for policymakers to assess the socio-hydrological vulnerability in Mexico City, according to different scenarios. It's part of a blueprint of projects which can be applied in, part of a series of projects which are a blueprint which can be laid out in other locations, such as Oaxaca is happening in UK and South Africa. The cartographic tool was developed across the city to assess water vulnerability due to ecological crisis and the city's historical water management policies. This tool develops present and future scenarios where specific interventions can mitigate the impact of socio-ecological issues and help shape policies with a direct impact on the city space. As you probably know, Mexico City is quite apocalyptic. It's built on a wetland and it has used the extraction of water from its aquifers, which is causing the gradual sinking of the city, with frequent city-shutting floods and dangerous subsidence. 3 rivers, located 300 kilometers away and 100 meters below the city, provide water for the city. So a huge amount of energy is spent pumping the water into the city. And it has another issue, which is the combined rainwater and sewage network system. This screenshot is part of an interactive tool that the Ground Lab have developed with two main aspects. It creates an index of vulnerability over the city in terms of water security in Mexico using hydrological parameters, summarized by levels of water stress, and socioeconomic aspects that describe the adaptive capacity of different areas across the city. The index highlights areas most vulnerable in red to help make decisions of where to act first according to available resources. This screenshot describes the second part of the tool, which projects the impact on the same scenarios with the implementation of solutions, such as constructed wetlands that could help alleviate water vulnerability. The project shows where such design measures could have the most impact according to available budgets, while describing the benefits they could bring to people in those neighborhoods. Here's a short video which goes more depth.
Mexico City has increased its socio-hydrological vulnerability. This situation is being aggravated by climate change, which is why it is essential to develop decentralized, sustainable solutions that can generate resilience. To measure the impact of these solutions, the socio-hydrological resilience model evaluates the vulnerability of the city. From different perspectives, according to the criteria of various stakeholders. In a current scenario, and according to the increasing pressures due to climate change in the future for the year 2050. Thus visualizing the areas with the highest risk to prioritize green infrastructure interventions. The model uses constructed wetlands as prototypes to mitigate the vulnerability of Mexico City, and distributes the wetlands across the city according to its vulnerability and viability, and according to different budget proposals, highlighting the specific benefits that constructed wetlands will have on the neighborhoods of the city, and using parameters that maximize their impacts on vulnerability. The model visualizes the urgency of the situation by comparing the impact of the wetlands if they're implemented in 2020 or much later, in 2050, which shows a greater resilience with a short-term implementation, especially in the most vulnerable areas. Designed as open source, the model has the flexibility to include new resilient green infrastructure solutions, include the voices of other stakeholders, experts, and communities in the scenarios, and adapt databases and parameters for the City of Mexico or to the context of other cities.
What I find most exciting about this type of work by Ground Lab is they're not only making visible the flows and the forces which shape our landscapes and cities, and they're providing also tools which help us to interact with these flows in a smarter way. Their projects are scalar and ecological in the broadest sense, about connections between the detail and planetary flows. And I'll briefly touch on another project which highlights this as well. The graphics indicate this kind of planetary implication of the projects. It's one of their students' projects which seeks to improve the commons of Antarctica, where krill is being overfished, contextualizing this complex in-between continent of land, sea, and ice of Antarctica. Its political framework of national claimants, the different countries which are claiming ownership on the global commons, to processing centers around the world, linking salmon farms in Scotland to the Antarctic, and finally to food on our plate in the UK. The end result of the project is a new visualization of the dynamic system of the ocean and marketplace, which can be used for writing dynamic and global protection policies, as well as food labeling systems. And it's important that these policies are dynamic because obviously the krill populations and their locations are dynamic, instead of the current latitude and longitude defined protection zones. It's only by making those ecological webs of dependence visible that we dare to hope to maintain some control of them. I'm going to change scales now and come back to more building projects, talk about the more traditional third nature and 2 projects I've worked on, which are really also interested again in what a landscape can do, how it's a catalyst, but more in a traditional effect onto the human body, and the important role landscape plays to connect us with something larger than ourselves, to connect us to those planetary flows, even if in a subconscious way. For those of you who don't know, I'll talk about the Maggie Centres, which are a UK charity started by Charles and Maggie Jencks, my parents. They create cancer centres, mostly in the UK, for anybody affected by cancer. They would argue that architecture, and indeed, very importantly, the gardens and landscape can make a difference to healthcare. The healthcare environment can influence the culture of a hospital, the care of patients, and also the people that care for them. Firstly, I want to talk briefly about the program, as it's not just about the architecture. Maggie's aim to support people in every stage of their experience of cancer and anyone affected by cancer close to them. There are 3 main types of support: practical support, lifestyle support, and emotional support. All are an incredibly important part of living with a life-threatening disease, and the types of care that the public health system has a hard time providing due to tight budgets and time restraints. Sorry, 1 second. There are 29 centres around the UK now. I was working on I was working in OMA's office, and while they were designing the Maggie Centre there, and I did this diagram, which is looking at many of the existing centres, analysing them in different ways, and you'll see that most of them are this kind of wheel and spoke organisation, particularly clear in Richard Rogers' Hammersmith Hospital, where you enter into the centre of the building, and then the more private rooms are on the end of a spoke. That centre space is very important. It's the kitchen of the Maggie Centres, where the kitchen table is, and as you walk in, you should kind of be able to quickly orient yourself, feel at home, and orient yourself around the building. Of course, I was working at OMA's office, so REM wanted to do the opposite of that, and to empty out the centre and put a courtyard, bring a garden into the centre of the building. The entrance to the Maggie Centre is a really important buffer zone, separating us from the hospital and oncology unit that the visitor has just left. And this is the site for the location for Gart Naval Hospital in Glasgow, which we worked on. The entrance garden has to encourage us into the building and provide a moment or 2 to decompress, consider the path ahead, leave that hospital building and your oncology experience behind. And inside the centre, OMA had these interlocking volumes which provide different views out into the courtyard and into the buffer landscape around. The view into the garden is known to provide some healthcare benefits. It is that connection to something larger than the quotidian life of being a patient, such as the cosmic rhythms and cycles of nature. And I've spoken to a patient in Glasgow who said very movingly, "Damn it, I'm going to live to see the daffodils bloom." So that's a catalyst for you, if ever there was one. Indeed, all the classic stress-busting, mood-enhancing effects of nature, flooding the interior of the building, dancing leaves, natural light, shimmering greens. A very simple move for the landscape was the creation of a swale, which ensures that the grey skies of Glasgow are doing something to encourage habitat diversity by providing a wet area for different types of plants to grow, and emphasizing the separation from the surrounding hospital. So that's a view of the back with the hospital behind you. And also providing a kind of changing nature, emphasizing the changing nature over the seasons in Glasgow. So this wet area is only seasonally dependent. The experience of that swale from the inside of the building means that at the back you sit nestled into deep, kind of under the building, in a private space. These are the consulting rooms, which are the most private rooms of the building. And on the more public rooms, you're cantilevering out, a kind of optimistic view out to the distant hills over the landscape. This is the view from that kitchen, the kitchen table I was talking about. The path through the building continues into the woodland beyond, that leads you to an unexpected installation which uses tree stumps that were removed during construction which are kind of mirrors on top, and a woodland dome that unexpectedly brings the sky to the floor, which is a place for contemplation. The second Maggie Centre I'll present briefly is one by Frank Gehry. Our design, we're looking at the formal arrangements and spatial complexity of the Chinese scholars' gardens, the subdivision of space into smaller space using frames and windows, and the soft planting and waters that flow around corners, which are always kind of used to emphasize the continuation of the garden beyond the defines of it. The plan is similar to that original one I showed you, which is a wheel and spokes organization, a central hub with a kitchen radiating to the more private rooms. The building's nestled between two ponds. And as you enter, you see several views out into the garden beyond, immediately pulling you to the natural light. And this view out to nature is an important part of the therapeutic quality. Probably many of you know that now much quoted study by Roger Ulrich in 1984. I laugh because students use it all the time. But it's where he showed that a view of a natural landscape improved recovery, post-operative recovery times, and that really you need just a view of a natural landscape, which I would disagree with. But anecdotally unpacking that Ulrich's study, I've discussed with patients their relationship and use of the gardens and how they're helped by the green environment. For some, it's that view. For some, it might be a psychological engagement. And for others, it might be the physical engagement of doing some actual gardening, community, working with a community on gardening schemes, of which there are several at Maggie's, even if it's only just to pick some herbs for the kitchen garden, for the kitchen in the garden. And for other patients, a diagnosis that shakes your sense of your own mortality, makes every sensuous experience more intense. So they've described how a magnolia's perfume caught on the wind is more vivid after a cancer diagnosis, or the sunlight on a rock casts even deeper shadows. So driven by this catalyst theme, my talk has been really about what landscapes can do and how they can make visible the global flows of local designs and structures, becoming a catalyst for ecological policies and action, and how it also can perform on the human body, how we move through space as a psychological and physical health. But I don't want to suggest that I'm not interested in how things look, which probably many people think is kind of the opposite side of what something does. It's a classic division in architecture, right? Something functionalism, or what something looks like, what something means. I am really interested in also this image of nature and what an image can do. This image of nature comes from the tradition of landscape painting, right? So skip was the first description of landscaping, usually cited as the beginning of the profession, which is most well known in the development of the picturesque garden, a highly artificial but seemingly natural representation of nature itself, using those first and second natures to create third nature. Of course, that landscape imagery is not just a product of the West. In Asia, the development of landscape painting, which was a philosophical and epistemological project as much as an aesthetic one, meant that the idea of landscape was tied to imagery and representation of nature as itself. The result being many beautiful gardens through Asia, some that are meant to be not experienced by the body, but only by the eyes. And this more conceptual idea of landscape gardens has resulted in some enjoyable images of nature, where what is natural and artificial has been a playful game. It's a game that I've played in a small art installation, a miniaturization of the picturesque landscape of Stowe, and the relationship between natural and artificial, native and alien, real and artifice, pastoral and plastic, all played out in Canary Wharf. Played out in Canary Wharf, which is one of the most highly constructed insta-city developments that we have in London, which is a development type that's now becoming naturalized, creating an artificial pop-up garden picnic spot as a place to ponder these questions. So I'll go into detail about one large project, which is all about this idea of nature as a place to contemplate your place in the universe, to think about your planetary perspective, and to kind of recreate a hyper-naturalistic view. It's in an ancient farm setting, not far from where wheat was first cultivated 11,000 years ago. in a small village in Turkey. It's about 500 miles south of Istanbul, in an underserved area of the countryside. So we read this project and the site through the prism of these three typical types of nature, the three forces that had shaped the site. First, nature. It's not totally wild. I mean, but where is? But these boulders haven't been moved by man, and some of the sites are too steep to really have been ever been really farmed. Much of the rest of the site is flat enough to be farmland, second nature. And finally, as we visited with our client, we saw him as the most recent actor in shaping the landscape, where he's adding this program of a new media sculpture park, which we're going to do. We do the master plan for, and also doing a new media installation in. This is third nature. This is the cultural layer. Reading this landscape and these three actors, we wanted to come up with a narrative that would give a deeper understanding of the site and the idea of these that we're part of an evolutionary paradigm. It's a huge project, so I won't go into massive detail. The image of landscape will be my focus. So this is the main narrative we deciphered. It's a timeline in 3 stages that goes back to the Big Bang. A story of the evolution of the site. The first era is the era of minerals. The second major era, the era of life. And the third, the era of culture. Again, kind of aligning with those 3 ideas of nature. And it tells the story of how the site came to be here, at the end here, from the Big Bang, the evolution of minerals, through the creation of our planet Earth, which has this incredible plate tectonics that we know created the first minerals which allowed life to exist. So it's one of the unique things about our planet, are the plate tectonics that allow the evolution of minerals. Through the first cell wall, it's that incredible miracle of life appearing on this planet. Still, we don't know how. RNA, DNA, the beginnings of life, and then as you come, life evolves in complex enough forms to create something that we call consciousness, and eventually culture, and a new media sculpture park. So here you see the 3 eras designed as lakes and cascades, gardens, arranged along a seasonal stream. Walking through the eras of the universe is a meditative walk with points for contemplation. It's almost like walking through stations of the cross, as you would in a Catholic church. A garden is a microcosm of the macrocosmic story. Starting with the first lake, at the beginning of time and space, when pure energy created the Big Bang, with a dam wall and a maze which rips up the Earth. This is the era of minerals. It's gray, it's violent, it's a dark time. Beginning with the era of life, celebrated with the cell walls and the DNA terraces. This is the force of living matter which turned that gray mineral landscape into green and colorful mosaic. And finally, the amphitheater of consciousness, which uses a dam wall for projections and new media performances. Just a few views of it. So this is the Big Bang explosion with the existing trees that are along the stream that will die. This is the cells of life. Sorry, it's jumped on. This is the era of life, which has started to be built, dramatized in landforms and retaining walls, and celebrating the importance of plate tectonics, I mentioned before, with this kind of layer of interpretation, particularly on the site because it's Turkey, which we know has a very violent tectonic history. Opening onto Lake 2 with the cell wall and the curving lipid layers of the cell wall. 80% of the material that we're using comes from the site, so it's basically cut and fill, or it's carving up the rocks, those boulders that you saw onto the site, to create any stonework we need. And then this Lake 3, which we're just working on the design for, is built mostly, the client has a pipe business, so it's basically using the recycled offcuts from his pipe business to create a series of lines which describe opening the development of consciousness. So that's a view of the land art installation. I call it land art rather than landscape for various reasons, but it's really about a view of nature and a representation of nature, less about what the project catalyzes on the site, but more about connecting us to that cosmic and planetary story and understanding our place in the cosmic narrative as you walk through the landscape. So what I've shown today is a few different views of landscape as catalyst, not the usual catalyst of placemaking or activated public space, but a catalyst for planetary thinking. And the dark side of the moon in the title are the invisible flows of zero nature, the forces and forms which we don't see, but which are forming the world around us. And it's the landscapes that depend on and both impact and depend on those forces. Even those invisible forces, probably more so than the visible ones. With that being said, I don't think we can forget the other side of the coin, or the moon in this metaphor, that there are catalytic images as well. It's not just what something does, it's also obviously important what it looks like. And those stories and narratives are very important. Referring to our cosmic origins and also referring back to that zero nature, which show nature not just as a passive setting for human action, but as an active subject, actively working to keep Gaia stable. It's a bit of a morality tale, but otherwise our own passive images of nature might eat us up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Gaia is an incredible force, is it not? Aren't we being subjected to it in an extreme form right now?
We are, exactly. And if we're not more conscious of it, as I said, it will eat us up.
Well, maybe this is a naive question, but how do we deal with the forces of Gaia, really, to make any actual difference? Aren't we just talking about tinkering with local environments to sort of make us feel better? Or do you think it might actually, there might be foreseeably a time when man-made environments can actually contribute positively to the planetary balance?
Well, I think we should be aiming for that. This idea of a regenerative real estate, built environment, that what we're building should contribute positively, better biodiversity, better habitat, cleaner water, cleaner air. Our built environment should be doing that, eventually. That should be our aim. But whether we can really we won't be able to control Gaia, but we will have to work with her.
Well, it's obviously an extremely large subject, but just sticking with the big for a second, what about the fact that over the period which you mapped out, and in particular the presence and effect of man, deserts have been created?
Yeah.
I don't know whether the Sahara is thought to be man-made or in part came about because of interference from mankind, or whether it was a natural phenomena. But there are certainly other parts. I think Saudi Arabia was once not all desert in the center, that there are major parts of the globe. Do you think there's any possibility that they can be recouped as more dynamic ecosystems that can rebalance the way the world works? Or are even deserts
it will keep changing. It will keep changing.
But we're used to it changing for the worse.
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. I don't know. I mean, can it be? Can they? The systems at play are so large and complex for us, right? So we're now starting to understand these planetary flows. We're starting to map them and see them. And so that's why I was really interested in that in the first project I presented by my colleagues, like how we map those and therefore start to act on them. But how those flows are then connected to, the smallest garden is doing something in that.
Well, with the Maggie centers, you showed purposefully small relatively small environments that connect to a small building, and how they can give you large experiences, really, that they're not municipal gardens, they're not ones that are necessarily what the low maintenance garden, you know how people say, oh, I've concreted over the front of my house, the garden in the front of my house, so it's low maintenance. That's really the opposite of the argument, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But the one in Turkey, it must be quite big. So surely the bigger the better, the bigger the more kind of rewarding the effects, the more the wildlife returns, and that, you know, the management of water, as you explained with the Mexico City. How big is the project in Turkey in hectares?
60 hectares.
60?
So, yeah.
Well, that's not that big.
It's not that big.
So it's not as big as the average farm, let's say.
That's the area that we are, yes. It's part of a larger farmland that's probably 10 times that. But our space. Yeah.
I was intrigued with your drawing. You did a kind of abstracted, but quite figurative interpretation of the phases of landscape in the garden in Turkey. So I forget what the early one was, but the later ones were leaves, I think.
Yeah.
And the amphitheater.
Yeah.
Why did you feel the need to be that representative about the leaves?
Well, I don't want to talk particularly about the leaves, but I'm really interesting about figuration and meaning and communication. And obviously, I'm a postmodern child, so I'm interested in this. But I think there's an issue with landscape design. Again, it's this issue of image. We don't see landscape. It's background, it's wallpaper, it's invisible to us. It's natural, it's just there, it exists. So I do think that we need, partly as landscape architects, to wake people up, right? To make them see it afresh, to show them that there are all these incredible processes that are going on in nature, and maybe to make it a little bit artificial in that way, so that people see it. If you don't see it, you can't appreciate it.
But if you're doing a landscape that, you're drawing a branch, say, with leaves, that is visible from the air, from a balloon.
Yeah.
But when you walk in it, can you see there's a leaf or a branch?
Well, there's topography around the edge, so there are kind of hills on the side, but whether or not you read it exactly as a leaf or whether you read it just as a series of undulating landforms that look like something you want to walk through, and then you get closer and you experience the detail of it, which will tell you about it. I think there are lots of different ways that you can understand the meaning of it. It's not just looking at the silhouetted form. That silhouetted form more is a kind of break from the surroundings.
Well, in some ways, what you're advocating seems to me a little bit like archaeological sites, when the architecture of a previously existing town, city, villa, whatever, has been lost over time, and maybe what was once architecture has been replaced with sort of ridges of soft forms in earth. And I think maybe parts of Hadrian's Wall are like that. Certainly many sites, Etruscan, Roman sites in Italy, we're kind of used to seeing that kind of reclaiming of nature. And does that square with what you're talking about, or is that kind of alien?
Partly. There's also obviously a history of land forming that goes back also kind of prehistoric times as well. But very important to understand a site through an archaeological lens as well.
Well, because you as a landscape architect, you are interfering with the land.
That's
but you're hoping to interfere positively rather than make it worse.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yes.
So you are playing God a bit.
Yeah, and you know, it's It's in part of, a wider conversation about land use as well, because there's a huge movement in the UK towards rewilding areas. So what areas are first, second, third, fourth nature? Like, how do we organize and distribute those areas? So like architecture, designing only 2% of the built environment, landscape architects design a small, very small amount of land. But
you have to compete with those people building infrastructure, the
yeah,
roads
or
and the car parks and all the hideous tarmac spaces that work against what you're doing. So I guess if we are to think about landscape in this way, we've really got to understand the way it works. And if you don't, so therefore the visual part has to, you're suggesting that it becomes secondary to what is invisible.
Yes, in some projects, yes.
In some projects.
There's always a caveat.
Well,
yes, I am. It has to be. I mean, we have to understand, first of all, that landscapes are doing things. They're doing things. They're always doing things. Even if, whatever we do, they're busy, busy, busy.
Well, like we've learned frequently, that trees support one another.
Yeah,
and
incredible
they
research on how trees communicate through mycelium. Yeah.
Exactly. But all of that happens best if we don't touch it. Mm-hmm. If we just leave it. Is that, or can you encourage that kind of, you can't create
Normally
that.
We're messing it up, yeah. Normally we're really messing it up. But there's got to be a place for us. I mean, this is the issue, right? So the rewilding project, we have to have areas which are conserved and preserved, but also there have to be areas for human interaction and human meaning and human culture. And again, my argument there is that those places should also be about relating us to the bigger forces at play, the bigger planetary forces. So the design of our landscapes should be relating us back to that zero nature or the first nature.
Partly what you're doing is encouraging landscape and the countryside, nature, to be a learning environment, a place where people perhaps who've not thought much about what nature really means or how it works. I mean, I remember my cousins who lived in Slough. They came to Malvern, which is in the countryside, and even when I was a child, they'd never seen any cows.
Yeah.
Because they hadn't experienced farm animals or what a farm does.
Yeah.
And gradually we've understood that farms have been ruining the quality of the earth and that the soil is pretty much dead.
Only when they're intensively farmed, and that there are lots of good regenerative farms that are able to keep, to contribute to the microbes. And so
anyway, I want you to be my teacher, please. And we should all pay more attention to these subjects because we have a precious planet which is being kind of burnt alive. And we're responsible for that. So I thank you hugely for your lessons today. Thank you very much, Lily Jencks.
Thank you so much, Nigel.
Bye-bye.